I think Richard was acting within the concepts of the Aristotelian perfect ruler, and I think that's what he was aiming to do.
It was the essence of this ideal of kingship that the baron should play a role greatly subordinate to that to which they were accustomed. Their response to the attempt to impose it would be brutal, would end in disaster for both Geoffrey Chaucer and the king. It was no surprise that Chaucer was able to ease himself into the king's new party with some facility. Richard was eager to encourage the use of English, in opposition to a church that would have liked to restrict its use. In fact, it is thought that Richard was the first English king to speak English as his native tongue, and Chaucer, the foremost man of letters of his age, was already writing in this preferred language. Not French nor Latin. The new king was eager to free himself from overmighty subjects who sought to control him, and to build a meritocracy around himself, to the great displeasure of the older nobility who saw them simply as the king's favourites. There's no doubt that Chaucer would now be viewed as a man of many talents, one who had proved himself as a diplomat and a civil servant, and would serve to be more than an adornment. Amongst Chaucer's friends and allies at the time would have been Sir Simon Burley, a close advisor to the king, who was also his former tutor. This was also a man with an excellent pedigree, both as a valiant soldier and diplomat, and the poet had accompanied him on at least one mission.
There's very little evidence in Chaucer's writing of what Chaucer himself thought about Richard II. You have, for example, the prologue to the Legend of Good Women, in which Chaucer describes himself in a meadow, and the god of love arrives with his queen Alceste. And it's quite clear to everybody that the god of love is Richard II, and Queen Alceste is Queen Anne of Bohemia. And Chaucer paints a very curious picture of the god of love being terribly angry, which you wouldn't expect for the god of love, but he's terribly angry and cross, and accuses Chaucer himself of writing terrible books against love, and Queen Alceste has to plead with the god of love, who is Richard, to calm down and spare this man, this poor poet, Chaucer. So it's a very jokey sort of portrait. And when you consider that Chaucer must have read this out in court, in the presence of Richard II and Anne of Bohemia, there must have been a very close relationship going on there, and everybody must be seeing the fun of it, of the way Richard was portrayed. Particularly if Richard cultivated this very stern manner, which I suspect is a possibility. However, we don't really, there's nothing directly about Richard II himself. However, what we can say is that the whole of Chaucer's writing is in support of the court and in support of Richard, because what one has to look at, in the 14th century, you'd had a huge revolution in the European courts. The courts were trying to assert themselves not only territorially, but kings throughout Europe had realized that there was not only a territorial claim to be made, but there was also an intellectual territory. And they were trying to establish their own courts with claims to scientific, literary, philosophical and theological work, and in their own language, and that's what was happening in Italy, that's happening in France. And so it's very vital for Richard, if he was going to be part of this new fashionable world of European courts, it was very important for Richard to establish a literature in English that would enhance his reign and make him able to hold his head up. And that is what Chaucer's doing. He's providing that body of literature in English.
During this first period of Richard's reign, Chaucer was to pen many of his more renowned works, though none of them more so than Troilus and Cressida, which was held to be only surpassed by the Canterbury Tales themselves. The two protagonists merit barely a mention in Homer's Iliad, where they first appear, and their tale of love betrayed came to Chaucer via French sources from Boccaccio. But Chaucer turned what had been a simple tale into a complex and engrossing psychological narrative, not lacking in wisdom and humour. The progress of his career as a senior customs officer in the early 80s was encouraging, and in 1382 he was appointed controller of the petty customs and wines, and in 1385 he was granted leave to appoint a permanent deputy. In the same year, ominously, the magnates proposed a bill to take the power of appointing customs officers away from the king. Then in 1386 something happened. His employment at the customs house came to an end, and he gave up his house in Aldgate. Whether the position was lost due to the hostility of the Duke of Gloucester, the king's uncle, who was opposed to the rise of the middle class, or whether Chaucer had sufficient to occupy his time elsewhere is moot. It is true that in 1385 he was appointed Justice of the Peace, and in 1386 he was elected Knight of the Shire. There is, however, a third possible interpretation of his action: that he could sense which way the wind was blowing, and that London was about to become a dangerous place for those of the king's court faction, which included Chaucer and his allies. The war was not going well, and it was suspected that Richard favoured peace. Despite a papal promise to all volunteers to remit the sins not only of the living but also the dead, and despite the pardoners promising that angels would descend to ship the souls in purgatory straight off to heaven, the Crusade of Flanders, led by the Bishop of Norwich, had been a fiasco. Back home and not meeting the enemy, an English expedition to Scotland, led by the king, had turned back with nothing achieved, but money wasted. Lancaster, dismayed by what he saw as the ruinous policies of the king and eager to advance his own interests in Castile, had finally managed to convince Parliament that his adventures in Spain would have a bearing on the war in France. With funds finally available, he left the country in 1386 in pursuit of his own potentially ruinous quest for the crown of Castile. With Gaunt gone, the king's enemies struck. Led by Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, and Thomas Arundel, the Bishop of Ely, in the name of the Commons, the king was summoned and reproved for his use of men who were not of their party, or what they called evil counsellors. They put his Chancellor, the Earl of Suffolk, on trial and had him imprisoned. Thomas Arundel took his place, while Gloucester shared leadership of a commission to direct the policies of the realm with the bishop's brother, Earl Richard of Arundel. The king, who was now 19, would continue to be treated as a minor, incapable of direct rule. Richard had no intention of accepting the terms, and by 1387 the Duke and the Earl were prepared to resort to arms. Through mediation, a meeting was arranged in Westminster Hall. A demand was made for the arrest of the leading members of the king's party, which Richard agreed to do but failed to carry out. One by one they slipped away, but when the king was once more confronted by his opponents in arms, he again caved in. A parliament was called by the opposing barons in 1388, now known as the Lords Appellant, and key allies of Richard were condemned to death, including Suffolk, the king's closest friend, and the Lord Lieutenant in Ireland, De Vere. Richard's queen, Anne of Bohemia, went down on her knees to Gloucester to plead for the life of one of the victims, Chaucer's old companion, Sir Simon Burley, to no avail. The only mercy shown was that, despite being condemned as traitors, they were beheaded rather than hanged. For their services to the country, the Lords Appellant persuaded Parliament to grant them the astonishing sum of £20,000. This Parliament has gone down in history as the Merciless Parliament, and its bloody effect was to darken not only the remainder of the 14th, but also the 15th century history of England. That Chaucer's life may well have been in danger is illustrated by what happened to his friend Thomas Uske. A poet who admired and imitated Chaucer, Uske had been the collector of customs between 1381 and 1384, when Chaucer was comptroller. He was appointed Under-Sheriff of London in 1387 and arrested by the merciless Parliament. He was hanged, drawn and beheaded, it taking 30 blows of the sword to finally do the job. A follower of Wycliffe, he had recanted in his prison cell. Although Chaucer was a member of Parliament for the Commons, it is not known whether he attended or lay low in the wilds of Kent. What is known is that by 1388 financial affairs were in a mess and a series of writs for debt were issued against him. It may have been to relieve the pressure that he sold his annuity, or it may have been the knowledge that Gloucester's party were demanding the cancellation of all the king's annuities. One suggestion is that he was in need of funds to enable him to take a journey abroad to the lands of his wife's family in Hainault and as far away from the storm as possible, and there is an anonymous biographer who tells us he did indeed spend time in Holland. What had happened to the fortune the Chaucer family must have built up remains a mystery. To return to 1387, a year that would turn out to have been politically catastrophic, and also one of the most momentous for English literature, for it was during this time that Chaucer commenced the Canterbury Tales. It has been suggested that perhaps we should take what he tells us about the pilgrimage more literally than we should otherwise be inclined to. His wife Philippa died in late 86 or early 87, and he may have been making a pilgrimage for the repose of her soul, and that what he relates of the journey to Canterbury mixes fact with fiction. In that case, when he says to us, "Befell that in that season on a day, in fellowship and pilgrims were they all," we may really suppose him to have been starting out from the Tabard in Southwark. The Tabard is probably the place with which Chaucer is best associated. The Great Fire of Southwark of 1676 destroyed it, together with much of the rest of the borough. The closest to it in time, location and style being the George, built next door to replace it, and one of the oldest inns of London. Although styles of building had changed over the ages, both were courtyard inns, with the court being used to accommodate the horses and carriages of new arrivals, and stables to one side to provide the horses with shelter. They're also used from time to time as places of entertainment, with plays and travelling shows being performed for the guests and locals. Only a blue plaque unveiled by Terry Jones in Borough High Street bears witness to the existence of the Pilgrims' Hostelry that was to be the Tabard, which had been built by the Abbot of Hyde in 1307. The Canterbury Tales was a revolutionary work, not just in its poetic rhythms, many of which appear to have been invented by Chaucer for this particular purpose. Its view of a contemporary English society from a layman's point of view is without precedent, and he makes clear in the prologue that he is going to tell his stories in the very language that is used without any attempt to spare blushes. He regards it as his duty to set things down as they are. Significantly, of the 29 pilgrims whom Chaucer meets and who come from a wide range of social levels, 8 are of the church. Only one is seen as a truly worthy servant of God. This is the poor parson, who is not prepared to excommunicate a poor man for not having paid his tithe, which was a tax payable to the church of a tenth of one's income. His not taking action was in defiance of church policy, and his rejection of it could be seen as a criticism of the church. Interestingly, he is accused by the host of being a lollard, an accusation that was also levelled at John Ball, the clerical mouthpiece of the peasants' revolt. The prioress is satirized gently and with humour. She has genteel and dainty manners, follows the fashions, and brings in her retinue a pack of spoilt toy dogs. Really, the only thing wrong with her is her station in life as a prioress. The other members of the church are not let off so easily. There's the monk, who loves hunting and good food. And as for Augustine's rules for monks, the saint is welcome to them. The monk is quite content to remain what he is, a man of the world. Next comes the friar, who falsely claims he can offer a better class of confession than a curate in order to drum up business, and is renowned for his ability to squeeze the last farthing out of a poor widow. Since he likes tavern life, he steers well clear of beggars and lepers. As for charitable works, he's paid for the marriage of numerous young women. It is to be understood that this is after he's enjoyed them himself and needs to be shot of them. The summoner is little better. His job was to bring those who infringe the laws of God and the church to the ecclesiastical courts, sort of religious policeman. He's a good fellow, though. He makes it quite clear that all the church is really after is their money. Your purse is the archdeacon's hell, he says, inferring they will only suffer for their sins financially. Chaucer is so indignant at this that he breaks cover and condemns him as a liar.
It's the summoner who tells a tale against the friar. The friar tells a tale against the summoner tells a tale against the friar. The summoner is a church official who goes around serving summonses, usually for people for sleeping with the wrong person or something like that, or for drinking too much or things like that. Quite a low-level officer of the church, and not a theological officer of the church. Anyway, the summoner tells a tale against the friar because in retaliation for the friar telling a tale against summoners. And he describes how a friar is taken down to hell by an angel, and he looks around and he says, "Oh, that's very good. I don't see any of us friars down here. It must mean we all go to hell, to heaven." And the angel says, no, come along with me. And the angel goes up and there's the devil that's sitting there. And the angel says, "Satanas, lift up your tail." And then Satan lifts up his tail, and out of the devil's arse swarm 50,000 friars. They fly all around hell, and then they go back into the devil's arse again, and the tail's clapped down. Now, that's not the kind of thing that Archbishop Arundel would have wanted to be written in English, making fun in such a sort of a strong way about of somebody who was people who were recognised by the church.
With the summoner is the strange eunuch-like figure of the pardoner, lank of hair and beardless, with a tiny voice. The suggestion is that he is as much a spiritual eunuch as a physical one. He carries with him a purse full of pardons, hot from Rome. As early as 1212, the church had noted the dangers of the corruption of the practice of selling pardons, but little was done. It was a convenient way of making money, and as far as his pardons go, he isn't fraudulent. They generally do come with the blessing of Rome, which reveals him to be a true representative of the church. Where his roguishness is made manifest is in the sacred relics he purports to carry. What he passes off as a saint's bones come from a pig. And we are told that selling them to peasants, he makes more in a day than the honest labourers earn in 2 months. While it is true that many of the lay characters are shown up as flawed, amongst them the merchant, the miller, the franklin, and the reeve, the greatest venom is reserved for these unworthy representatives of God. It was an extraordinary time to level such an attack on the church, at the very time the rebel Lord's campaign was in full flood. Their joint leader was the ultra-conservative and anti-Lollard Bishop Thomas Arundel. Is it possible that its timing had anything to do with Chaucer's inability to stomach the growing pretensions of this worldly prelate? It is difficult to underestimate strength of the reaction of the princes of the church. Poetry was still, by and large, a communal pleasure. The poet would read aloud from his works to provide an evening of entertainment to an aristocratic audience, and in Chaucer's case, the most select audience in the land, the king's court. Protected as he was by Gaunt and the king, this overt mockery of one of the great two powers of the realm was still walking on thin ice. Is it possible that Richard, in a mischievous mood, may have invited Thomas Arundel, the Bishop of Ely, to one of these poetry readings? Given this was the man who had been a key agitator for the deaths of his closest companions and friends, who would blame him? How intolerable it would have been for Arundel to be the foil of an impotent servant who dressed his impertinence in verse. A man who praised revolutionary and heretical philosophies, making a quasi-Lollard appear to be morally superior to the representatives of the true church. And all this scathing critique written in English, the same language as the new pernicious Bible. Whether the bishop or any other high-born churchman was ever actually present at a reading will never be known. Either way, word would have got around rapidly in the small world of London town. But finally, Chaucer could wait. There were bigger fish to fry.
How controversial was the Canterbury Tales when it was written? Well, it's a debatable point because you've got different the society is quite different from how we see it now. You've got the court, which was a very powerful organisation, but struggling with the barons. They're powerful as well. But you've also got the church. And the church, of course, in the 14th century had become very, very powerful indeed and very, very rich, and was even more powerful than the king. So that's where the power is based. It's not just in the aristocracy and the plebs. It's in this three-point power base of the church, the court, and the baronage. Now, there'd been a tradition of people mocking officers of the church, like friars and monks and things like that, in Latin, but in Chaucer's day, by the time he's writing the Canterbury Tales, to actually make fun of friars and monks and pardoners would have been actually quite controversial for the church. The church wouldn't have liked it.
2 years after Chaucer had begun his monumental task, the Canterbury Tales, in 1389, at a meeting of the council, the king expressed his intention to rule without intermediaries now that he was of age. He was in fact 22. A settlement had been reached with France, which was in accordance with the king's wishes and would endure for 26 years. And at the end of the year, Gaunt returned and was warmly welcomed both by the crowd and Richard. Chaucer must have felt it safe to return to London and was awarded the key position of Clerk of the King's Works, which included responsibilities for works carried out in the Tower and Westminster Palace, as well as Windsor Castle and other royal palaces, lodges and parks. He was also to construct scaffolds for 2 tournaments twice a year. Then in March of 1390 he was appointed to a commission to look after the walls, bridges, sewers and ditches along the Thames from Greenwich to Woolwich. In the same year he was robbed of his horse, his goods and £20, 6 shillings and 8 pence at Hatcham in Surrey. His robbers were caught, tried and convicted. He would have had to travel constantly carrying large sums of money. In September of that year, he was robbed twice within days, once at Westminster and once at Hatcham again, and on one of these occasions, beaten. He handed over his post the following year. Been suggested he was forced to do so, and may even have been suspected of lack of care or even of colluding in his own robbery. On the other hand, he may well have gone willingly, having decided he had become a marked man and it was too dangerous. As an aside, when he resigned, the government was £21 in arrears of his stipend. He was robbed of approximately that amount. He was shortly found fresh employment, and within 5 days of handing over his post was made Deputy Forester of the Royal Forest of Petherton in the southwest of England in Somerset. The appointment was in the hands of the Constable of Windsor Castle, and it is possible that he and Chaucer may have become acquainted when the poet was responsible for works undertaken in the castle. This was the last post he would hold. It would be renewed at the end of 1398, though it is unclear when the position terminated. With the country entering a period of peace, Richard had time to oversee the refurbishment of Westminster Hall, which was given a magnificent new roof, one of the glories of his reign. In 1394, Anne of Bohemia died. The opposite of Richard being plain and placid, she had been the object of his passionate devotion, rarely leaving his side. He immediately ordered a double tomb to be created in Westminster Abbey. For Richard, the Abbey was a special place of reverence where his much-loved wife would lie entombed, waiting for him to join her. Not surprising that he was infuriated when the Earl of Arundel arrived late at the funeral and immediately requested permission to be allowed to leave. Richard struck him to the ground and had him removed to the Tower, which he would only leave under bail of the massive sum of £40,000. During this period, with the country quiet as to domestic and foreign affairs, in the period from 1392 to 1395, Chaucer seems to have taken the Canterbury Tales as far as he was ever going to. Of his 30 pilgrims, including himself, we are left with 22 tales. It is not known whether Chaucer left the work unfinished, or whether there was at one time a more complete version of the Canterbury Tales that has not found its way down to us. In 1396, the peace with France was sealed with the marriage of Richard to the French king's oldest daughter, of whom he rapidly became very fond. He had behind him a successful expedition against the Irish, which had raised his reputation considerably. And on the surface, relations between himself and his former enemies seemed smooth enough. The king's uncle Gloucester seemed to have been pacified, and the only open sore was the ongoing hostility between Richard and the Earl of Arundel. Despite the ongoing hostility of the Earl, his brother the bishop had served as chancellor for 5 years. When Courtenay, the bishop who had tried to call Wycliffe to account, died, Thomas Arundel took his place as Archbishop of Canterbury.
I don't think Arundel changed the way the Archbishop's Canterbury behaved. I think, I don't know about before 1380, I don't know enough about the history there, but certainly you could say Courtenay, Archbishop Courtenay was the first really strong worldly bishop who takes power and who tries to stamp out the Wycliffite heresy, who tries to stamp out the criticism of the church. I think there'd been worldly bishops, and we call them worldly bishops, meaning that they were very rich, they were very powerful politically, and they were used the church as a political power base. Certainly Courtenay was like that. Simon Sudbury, who was executed by the rebels in 1381, was similar, although quite an interesting character Sudbury was, I think. I think when Arundel takes over as Archbishop of Canterbury, he's very much in that tradition of worldly bishops, archbishops who were running the church as a power base for their own political interests.
Canterbury might well claim to be the most sacred place in England. It certainly was the ultimate pilgrim destination, as many flocked year in, year out to visit the shrine